All right, so this whole thing started with the idea that the red pyramid was designed to produce ammonia. So again, that was what caused me to start looking into the chemistry behind all of this. So I started investigating the modern industrial process for the creation of ammonia. And I found that the two primary ingredients that we use today are methane and water. And I was pretty familiar with methane and the process required to produce it. And again, this is not high tech. This is the exact opposite. It is very, very rudimentary science. Again, it's just application of chemistry. I hate to even call it technology, but these were smart people that understood that you could use materials to your benefit as long as you understand what chemistry can be accomplished. So this is just a diagram of a fermentation chamber that is used to create methane gas. And it is a very, very simple structure where you have an inlet shaft on one side, you have your primary digestion chamber in the center, and then you have an outlet shaft where your decomposed substrate material is collected. Ground penetrating radar and did a thorough examination of this structure. And this is the diagram that they were able to create that shows the inlet shaft coming in from the north, which leads down into the structure. And you see the outlet shaft, which leads out to the south towards a very, very deep pit on the south side of the structure. And in this pit, that's where they would have collected the decomposed substrate material, because that's also a valuable agricultural fertilizer. So after the digestion process was complete, again, this decomposed substrate material been displaced out of that shaft, and they would have collected it and brought it back to the farms and used it as fertilizer. And this is just a final comparison, so you can see the similarities between, again, a very rudimentary structure that is used to produce methane gas. Again, this is quote unquote modern technology that's utilized to create this gas. And then again, the ancient structure that I believe was also utilized for the same purpose. It has all of the same components. And again, so when I was working with Ed, the gentleman that has the PhD in chemical engineering, there's no reason that this theory is not possible, right? Everything about the design of these structures indicates that it absolutely could have been used for these purposes. And again, I'm not dis-
Hello, this is Alan from the SGD channel, and once again I'd like to introduce Geoffrey Drumm, and this will be the third part. How you going, Jeff?
Good morning.
This will be the third part. Good evening from Australia.
Yeah.
This will be the third part in our discussion looking at his work, The Land of Chem. You'll find in the description the links to his Instagram, YouTube channel, which I assume will start posting very soon, but also his website where you can obtain his book. Now, his book is told as a novella, so it's written in a fictional sense, but there is solid information, hypothesis that he's proposing in there. So I think it's just important to point out that although it is delivered in this style, the essence of it, and I assume in the future you will be looking at it in a little bit more of a technical sense, but for the moment, the message is there in the book, and it should be, I think, just important to note, it should be read in that way.
Right.
Excellent. And so in the first two, we sort of talked about an overview of, well, just an introduction. So the underlying principles and concepts in regards to that. The essential point that he's proposing here is that especially the larger pyramids, for instance, the three pyramids at Giza, the stepped pyramid and the red and the bent pyramid, have an application in an industrial sense, in that they were used for, some would call it alchemy. I prefer the word chemistry because it leaves out some of those other connotations that often are mixed up with that word.
Agreed.
And here we see his logo, the Land of Chem, and that reflects the the red pyramid.
Yes,
and
sir.
the production. Yes, and in this particular presentation, we'll be looking at what is as he describes in his book, the first degree, which is the stepped pyramid, and that will do with the production of methane, and which would be putrefaction or fermentation would be the essential process of that. That, of course, is a very ancient process. Wine making, beer making, these are the types of things that involve fermentation, or what's sometimes called putrefaction. Before we begin, I think I just want to intro. So what is that these type of, now for instance, I'll bring up the point, in 500 BC, the ancient Chinese were drilling, and they were doing, and they, the Zhejiang salt mines, I believe is the name of a place, but they were drilling and piping natural gas to their homes for lighting and for heating.
Yes.
The salt mines themselves were an industrial process. So just before we begin, I think we're talking about it now. When we think industrialization, we tend to think the Industrial Revolution that happened in Western Europe in the 1700s, that sort of period. But industrialization actually goes back thousands of years. Now, an example would be ancient Rome, where they were using the aqueducts to make flour mills. But just think of the scale of the Roman Empire. They had mines, all sorts of productions, and they were really working on an industrial level. There was a civil war in Rome in the 3rd century AD. And what's interesting, I think, is also the Romans were essentially about to move away from fire to coal. So they were going to use water pumps to pump out the coal mines and get access to the coal that was down there beneath. They had steam technology, which had already existed for a couple of centuries. Huron of Alexandria, for instance, was using steam engines.
Yes.
And the Romans were virtually on the verge of an industrial revolution, that the way we think of it now. But they were definitely, ancient civilizations were definitely working on an industrial scale. Maybe might not look exactly of the way we think of factories and distribution, but it wasn't just about small little workshops sort of working randomly. Ancient Egypt was very bureaucratic. The Romans were very bureaucratic, and they were working, well, in a bureaucracy, but they were taking census. They really knew what they were doing. It wasn't just a random collection of workshops. It was an organized nation, and those nations are on the scale of nations that we have now. So the Nile Valley, for instance, it was estimates vary, but at least 2 million would have been the population there.
Yes.
And so I just want to introduce that concept. So it is true that you do not need large industrial scale structures to create these types of processes, but these ancient civilizations were equipping large armies. They were going on large campaigns. They were not just some little fiefdom. They were quite sophisticated in the bureaucratic sense, and that would, in essence, demand that you have some sense of organization or industrialization, because you simply cannot organize a nation if you're relying on haphazard small production units. You need to be able to organize these things and work in a large example. The tomb of Rekhmire, for instance, has some great paintings where they show the workshop process, whether it was making stone vessels or statues. They were working in an organized sense. It wasn't just a couple of craftsmen on their own. They were very well organized. So I just wanted to, maybe rambling a little bit at this point, but I just want to introduce that point, that even what we know in the official Orthodox history, they were organized civilization groups. Importing, even ancient Egypt was importing red cedar from far away. They were importing copper from Mesopotamia.
Yes.
And it's often it's not maybe even in the official, or not the official, the mainstream documentaries, that type of thing. They don't really emphasize the bureaucracy so much. People sort of seem to get fascinated on the paintings or the jewelry or the gold, but they don't tell the story of how these things were produced. And it is a little bit dry. It's not the most sexiest topic, you know, when you think of public service, but I think this is one of the points that this is why your hypothesis interests me so much, because we're looking at the nitty gritty of how it was done. And so, yes, it could be done on a small scale, but we are not talking about a small village or a small kingdom. We're talking about a large nation which was engaged in international trade. And that on its own would imply that there is something much more sophisticated. The economy, the organisation, armies, this cannot be done just by relying on a small workshop. But again, sorry to ramble. I just want
to.
And we'll be talking about the step pyramid, I believe, in this presentation. And that is the first degree, as is described in your novella.
Correct. So to give a little introduction to how the book works, right? So again, it's the story of a young man's initiation into this fictional ancient society that was responsible for the construction and operation of the Egyptian pyramids. So he's been initiated into chemistry during his apprenticeship, and then he travels with the senior member of the fraternity, Brother Julius, to Egypt to receive the degrees of the Egyptian pyramids. And through each degree, he is introduced to the secrets of each structure. So they arrive in Egypt, they arrive in the harbor of Saqqara, and they journey to the step pyramid where he's given the lost secrets. And at the time setting in the book, the pyramids are in full operation. So he's literally witnessing them at the height of their magnificence. And so again, he's just introduced into these sciences and given the secrets of their operation. Now, as you mentioned, we're going to be talking about methane today. And this is a very, very ancient, quote unquote, technology and understanding of chemistry. Again, it's utilized today even in rural India and rural nations. And I want to make the point right now that this is not high technology. If anything, this is the exact opposite of high technology, where this is very, very low technology, to the point where I hesitate to even call it technology. It is just utilization of knowledge in chemistry. And they were applying this science to improve the quality of their civilization. And as you mentioned, these were large-scale civilizations, and they had this knowledge, and they would have implemented it in structures that were compatible with the size of the population. So again, if you have millions of people to support, you're going to build structures that can produce the things that you need on a large scale. So my theory is that, again, chemistry was the prevailing science of this ancient civilization. And as these civilizations grew and expanded, they started to, again, implement small-scale knowledge into large-scale structures. And so when Egyptology as a science was being developed, this is in the mid-1800s, early 1900s, where our current civilization was undergoing the process of the modern industrial revolution. So the people that were looking at the Egyptian pyramids didn't necessarily perceive of them from the perspective of a society that had this knowledge of how to do chemicals and chemical reactions on a large scale. So again, they looked at these structures and evaluated them from what they knew then, which was pretty simple. So they interpret them as burial structures because they couldn't conceive of anything greater than that. So I think now, with the knowledge that we have today, it is appropriate to reevaluate these structures with our knowledge of chemistry and our knowledge of physics and our knowledge of chemical reactions, and reinterpret them with a more accurate idea of what they could have really been used for. And Alan, bear with me here, man. So it's very early in the morning. The sun is not quite up yet. So a little coffee to keep going.
if I could just make a declaration on my part. So just for those who, just in case there's any confusion, I myself am, I would say, more orthodox, conventional in the timeline, but I don't see a problem with this because, you know, I don't really see it being here nor there, because whether it was this date or that date, I don't think it really is important to what you're presenting.
Right.
But in regards, because as soon as you mentioned pyramids and the whole issue of tombs, this is a very emotive argument, let's say, in the comment section. And I'm not an Egypt, look, I got into this area through studying something else. I'm not really, Egypt is not my bag, let's say. I just sort of had to get into here because of the origins of architecture and that type of thing. But at least the way that I look at it, so this is just my perspective. For instance, St. Mary's Cathedral here in Sydney. What is its purpose? Well, it's a cathedral, yes, but there are tombs in the cathedral. So is the cathedral a tomb or is it a cathedral? Now, I could say the same for Chartres Cathedral in France.
Right.
Or Cologne in Germany. They were universities, but they were a cathedral, but they also contained tombs. So just to declare my position, right. I don't think that if there is a tomb in there, doesn't make it its primary purpose, because just like the cathedral has tombs, doesn't mean St. Mary's is a tomb. It is a cathedral. Or Chartres was also a university. And so I think that there can be many applications, so one thing doesn't necessarily exclude the other. But so again, I'm not a, you know, I got into Egypt for other reasons, but I'm not a, you know, that's not my primary sort of interest.
Right.
But also, I think just to head off that, I don't think that necessarily that there was a tomb in there doesn't necessarily make it primarily a tomb. Or there could be, again, I'm very open. So I'm open to discussion and with other people and their ideas as well. So, but it doesn't negate the fact that that something has a tomb doesn't make it its primary purpose a tomb.
Exactly.
Possibly a tomb might have been added later. I don't know. So just to declare my position, I'm not really, I'm sort of open to these ideas, but also just, again, that whole thing of tomb and pyramids, if you've seen the YouTube comment section, you know what sort of discussions these can bring up. But I don't proclaim to be on one position or another. But even if it was, I don't think that one excludes the other. And the date, and again, the dating, I don't think what you're proposing, that the date, whether it's non-conventional or conventional, is really an issue. It's I think it's because even if it is in a dynastic period or pre-dynastic period, the essence is still the same. And so I think just for others who are watching this, I think it's important not to get bogged down in the date or all the other small details in there, because without a time machine, we will never resolve these arguments, I think, in some people's minds. And history is a mess, because we really only, especially with Egypt, we have so little documentation that we, even the most orthodox of orthodox Egyptologists have to admit that there is so little documentation that we don't have a smoking gun, a document which says this or that. The whole issue of history really is more like a court case where you have to get the evidence and look for the preponderance of evidence, as they say, rather than we don't have we don't have a camera or a time machine to show us exactly what happened. So I am orthodox, but I'm more than willing to discuss these other issues, because without the time machine, we really won't know for sure. But anyway, just to drop that in there, just to put my position up front, and that if you're one way or the other, I don't think it really matters. Because, anyway, sorry.
And no, it's okay. Well, I would also agree with that. So I am not an archaeologist, right? I am not a scientist. I am not working with the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities and have given license to excavate and take samples and do experiments and test all of these theories, right? I am just looking at the bigger picture. and trying to reinterpret these structures with the knowledge that we have today and shine light on what I really think their true purpose was. I am not trying to disprove any conventional archaeology or history. I am not trying to disagree with the fact that the dynastic Egyptians absolutely repurposed these structures. Again, we're going to talk about that in depth when we go through the evolution of the step pyramid, because it was absolutely repurposed as a burial chamber. I'm well aware of that. All I'm saying is these structures were around before and they had a different purpose originally. And when the dynastic Egyptians came around, they said, hey, well, these are great places. They're already built. Let's reuse these structures. And again, they did repurpose them for burial chambers, which we'll see some evidence for that today. But the evidence also indicates that it was a repurposing. So there's very clear details that show that, again, what the dynastic Egyptians put in here was not part of the original structure. So let's get right into it. So at this point in the theory, this is also the point where people are either going to love this or they're going to hate it. And again, I'm not here to change anybody's mind or, again, refute conventional Egyptology. All I'm trying to do is present some different ideas. Again, I think this is a really valid theory. I think there's a lot of merit to this theory. And once we dive into it, the further we go along, you'll understand more about my justification for this theory. So kind of to rehash where we were before and give a little background on the time frame and what was going on during that time period. And I'm not saying that these structures are 100,000 years old. Again, we're just pushing the timeline back slightly to a time period where there was much more water in the Sahara. There was much more farmland. And so in the previous video, we were discussing that during this time frame between 8500 BC and 5300 BC, again, there was significant rainfall in the area. The populations were dispersed into the upper Sahara, and there was lots and lots of farming going on, and there was large-scale domestication of cattle. So there would have been 3 resources in abundant supply. You would have had plentiful water, there would have been agricultural surplus material, and tons of cattle manure. And this ancient civilization, they would not have been a wasteful culture, and they would have repurposed all of these things. And again, we know for sure that these civilizations were familiar with the science of fermentation. And as alchemists or as chemists, they would have been experimenting with the materials that they had on hand and could have developed this understanding and implemented it, again, the same way that rural civilizations do today for very simple purposes like boiling water or for heating homes or for lighting. I'm not implying that they had combustion engines or any sort of, again, quote unquote, high technology. I want to keep making that point that these structures utilized the most simple and primitive understanding of physics and chemistry to achieve miraculous chemical reactions. And of course, it's not done on the same scale that we have today. It's not done with the same efficiency that we have today. My point is that it was done and it was accomplished. And there are indications across the board that these structures had a functional purpose. So again, domestication of cattle, plentiful rainfall, agricultural surplus. You have all 3 materials that are required to produce methane. Again, the agricultural surplus material, the cattle manure, which provides the bacteria that start the anaerobic digestion process that creates the methane, and the water to create this slurry. So we know for sure that the Egyptian civilization operated in a cycle, and it was very, very much dependent on the flooding of the Nile River. So you would have had your flooding season, your growing season, and your harvesting season. And in the book and in my theory, the flooding season was the time period that they produced their chemicals. Because again, during the growing and harvesting season, the population would have been focused on the agricultural aspects of life. Again, tending to the crops, harvesting the crops. But after the harvesting was completed, again, you have this abundant agricultural surplus of agricultural waste material, and there's plenty of water. And this is a down period for the Egyptians where there was no farming going on. So they would have done other things that, again, could have increased the efficiency of the farming process when it did occur. So again, when Aquari and brother Julius arrived to Egypt, their first destination is the Step Pyramid. And I really like these maps because it does indicate where the Nile River waterline would have reached during the time of the flooding. And the Nile would have come all the way up to these river temples. And the river temples were connected to causeways that led into the structures. And when the river flooded, the excess water was channeled through the causeways into the reservoirs or complexes that surrounded these pyramids. So that's how they got the water into the pyramids. Again, it was that flooding process that brought it up to the Nile River Temple. And then again, it was channeled through the causeways into the structures. I just really like some of these old maps because, again, it does show exactly where that Nile River would have been. And I hope you guys can see the little pointer that I'm using here. So you can see exactly what I'm talking about.
If you could skip back to that previous picture with the map, just to,
Yes.
Yeah. So anyway, I did a few videos before, but now you can see where the river is currently, but where the river would rise to is literally that green line, which comes from, and I'll insert some photos where the flood come right up to the base of the Great Pyramid.
Yep.
Which is a distance of about 8 miles as that map sort of shows now. Now, was it 1969, 1970, they built the High Aswan Dam.
Correct.
And now the Nile flows constant.
Yes.
I've said that the Nile flooding was the heartbeat, not only of Egypt, but even the Tigris, Euphrates, the Mississippi River, the Danube. In the last couple of centuries, we've changed the flow of rivers so much that we've lost touch with what was the old heartbeat of not just Egypt, but every river civilization across the world. You would have this annual flooding cycle.
Right.
And I think that tends to be missing both from the, let's call it the alternative, but also the orthodox presentations when it comes to Egypt. I don't think they really give justice to how important the annual flooding cycle was for every ancient civilization across the world, not just Egypt. But, yeah.
Absolutely.
And that massive distance from where the river is now, just following that green line. And places such as the Karnak Temple, they have walls around the outside because during the flood season, they would be underwater.
Right.
I've seen so you're going to show us some slides in a moment, but even the Great Pyramid, the Step Pyramid, they had walls around the outside, which might be again so like temple like Karnak or Luxor, which are right next to the current river. These walls that were surrounding the pyramid structures as well could also have been flood protections. Let's put it in that sense, because what the Nile flood is in the last few millennia is not necessarily what it used to be before, because the Nile has changed its course over the last thousands of years. And
correct. So the area here to the left in this picture, that's the desert area, and this green section in the middle, this entire area would have been flooded with water, and that's actually what creates this farmland here. Was the recurring flooding of the Nile River that again hydrated all of this area that turned it into farmland. And again, that was again in the time frame in the book, you would have had significantly more rainfall across the board, and there would have been much more arable farmland. This area to the left wouldn't have been a desert, but the Nile would have still flooded. And I still use that as the impetus for the chemical production cycle was the flooding of the Nile River, because it really works with, again, the cycle of the Egyptian civilization in regard to the growth and harvesting season. And again, when there's no need for farming applications, you have to have something else to occupy your time, and they were making chemicals.
And I just one quick point, even during the Roman and Greek times, they knew that the flooding, this annual flooding cycle was somewhere between 7 and 9 meters that the river rose. So it was,
Right.
It was no small amount. It was quite a considerable amount of water would come down during that period.
Correct. And so again, you mentioned the walls around these structures. All of the major pyramids were surrounded with very, very high walls. Again, the step pyramid, the walls around that one were 33 feet high. That is pretty much the indication across the board that and I believe they're reservoirs. They are to retain water, again, from that excess water from the flooding channeled through the causeways. The causeways lead into the reservoirs, and then the reservoirs contain the water that was used within the structures for the chemical reaction process. And the water is either or both a mechanism of operation used to facilitate the chemical reactions, or it's an ingredient in the chemical reaction process in terms of creation of a slurry in this particular example. So this is just a quote from the book. Again, when Aquarius and brother Julius arrive in Saqqara, they get off their boat in the harbor, and it's right at the river temple. And it was summer in Egypt, the peak season of the alCHEMICAL, and the inundated waters of the Nile River had already reached the threshold of the temple. So again, the water is lapping up against the temple. Again, they can get right off their boat and go directly into these river temples. And there's every indication that that is actually an archaeological and historical fact. Again, you can even see in here in these old pictures that the water came up very, very close to these structures. So again, I think they were designed to utilize that flooding process, again, to facilitate and initiate these chemical reactions. And I love these slides, Alan, that you put together, because again, it really, it resonates with the idea I had in mind when I was writing this book. And again, so Aquarian brother Julius arrive at the step pyramid, and when they get there, it would have looked like this. It was a large industrial complex that would have been overwhelmingly impressive to see it in full operation. And when Aquarius is receiving these degrees, again, it's full scale, it's live, and he's literally witnessing as it happens and is being told the evolution and the history of this structure, because it wasn't always this large complex. It wasn't always a 6-stepped pyramid. And we'll talk about that here in just a sec. But these are just a few renderings that show what it would have looked like in its height. Again, it's pretty impressive. And what you see here is more indicative to me of an industrial scale manufacturing complex than some sort of burial site. Again, there's these large galleries here on the left side, and on the right side you would have had this processing facility, and I'll go into much further depth into what exactly those are later in this presentation. All right, so this whole thing started with the idea that the red pyramid was designed to produce ammonia. So again, that was what caused me to start looking into the chemistry behind all of this. So I started investigating the modern industrial process for the creation of ammonia. And I found that the 2 primary ingredients that we use today are methane and water. And I was pretty familiar with methane and the process required to produce it. And again, this is not high tech. This is the exact opposite. It is very, very rudimentary science. Again, it's just application of chemistry. I hate to even call it technology, but these were smart people that understood that you could use materials to your benefit as long as you understand what chemistry can be accomplished. So this is just a diagram of a fermentation chamber that is used to create methane gas. And it is a very, very simple structure where you have an inlet shaft on one side, you have your primary digestion chamber in the center, and then you have an outlet shaft where your decomposed substrate material is collected. So the process involves you create the slurry, step number one. And creation of the slurry involves water, again, any sort of agricultural surplus or waste material, which provides your carbon. And then you have your cattle manure, which provides the bacteria that are required to start the anaerobic digestion or fermentation process. And it's these bacteria that decompose the material and generate the methane gas. And as the substrate is decomposed in your fermentation chamber, the methane gas just rises out of the liquid and it can be collected out of the top of the structure. So again, this is a very, very simple quote unquote technology. All it is application of a very ancient science and understanding of fermentation. This is utilized in rural areas even today. As you mentioned, the ancient Chinese were utilizing methane. So again, I don't think it's any stretch of an imagination that the ancient Egyptians, or rather the pre-dynastic Egyptians, would have had this knowledge and would have been able to apply it in a large scale structure. And as soon as I saw this diagram, again, at this point, I was already really familiar with all of the pyramids and their internal layouts. As soon as I saw this, I knew exactly where I was going in terms of investigating a structure that could produce this. Particularly when I saw this diagram, this one here at the bottom, it was really screaming out to me. It was like, hey, we're looking at the step pyramid, because I knew that the step pyramid had this central rectangular shaft or rectangular chamber. It had an inlet and it had an outlet. And again, like I mentioned in the previous video, the form and the design of these structures implies their function. And if you can reevaluate them using these flow diagrams and the idea that they were utilizing water and liquid in a manner that would allow them to produce chemical reactions, you can start to see the way these structures actually worked. So again, let's just review here. You have a mixing pit on one side, you have an inlet shaft that leads into your primary fermentation chamber, and then you have an outlet shaft that utilizes displacement to push that decomposed substrate material out of the structure. And then you have a gas collection chamber on the top of the structure. And again, you just collect the gas out of the top of the collection chamber. So again, let's look at some diagrams of the step pyramid. And you can immediately see a correlation between the design of this structure and the design of the fermentation chamber. So again, if you want to look at it on this one, and again, the step pyramid underwent a series of renovations and a series of reconstructions prior to it being repurposed by the dynastic Egyptians. So originally this was a single level platform with this central rectangular chamber, and they call these mastabas. And you can see here on this diagram on the left that the original entrance to this structure would have been right here. So you would have had an inlet going into the chamber and then an outlet leading out of the chamber. Now these older diagrams don't necessarily show the full outlet shaft, but in the subsequent slides, there was some modern reevaluation and modern studies done on the step pyramid, and it does show they use ground penetrating radar and all sorts of 3D imaging inside these structures, and they produced a really, really excellent diagram that shows all the inlet and outlet shafts. So again, if this was originally a burial structure and you were designing this mastaba as a burial, as you rebuilt the structures, why would you extend the inlet shaft? So you'll see here that the inlet shaft that originally led into the chamber is at point number A. And as the structure expanded, you see here Pyramid 1 and Pyramid 2, the base of the structure grew and the base of the structure expanded. The original inlet shaft was covered by the expansion. And again, if this was a burial chamber, you would want to just seal it up permanently so that people couldn't get in and out of the structure. There would be no reason to extend the inlet shaft unless that inlet shaft had a function. And you can see here that the inlet shaft was extended as the base of the pyramid grew. So again, that is an indication that this is a functional part of the structure, and that, again, the original intention behind this building was not as a burial. It was to produce methane. And again, here on this diagram to the right, this is actually at the entrance of Saqqara when you go to the monument. This is just there's this placard or whatever standing out in front. You can see this collection chamber at the top of the structure. So these are just some images from the Latvian scientific mission in Saqqara, which was in 2007. And again, they used this 3D scanning, 3D imaging, and ground penetrating radar and did a thorough examination of this structure. And this is the diagram that they were able to create that shows the inlet shaft coming in from the north, which leads down into the structure. And you see the outlet shaft, which leads out to the south towards a very, very deep pit on the south side of the structure. And in this pit, that's where they would have collected the decomposed substrate material, because that's also a valuable agricultural fertilizer. So after the digestion process was complete, again, this decomposed substrate material been displaced out of that shaft, and they would have collected it and brought it back to the farms and used it as fertilizer. So you'll also see here in this diagram that there are a number of shafts and tunnels that were dug adjacent to the main digestion chamber. And I have an idea as to why these were originally created. And this is where you find the funerary apartments that were repurposed for the burial of the Pharaoh Djoser. And we'll get into that here in just a bit. But again, I really like this diagram because it is most recent and it is the most technically accurate. And it does indicate that there is an inlet shaft leading into the structure and an outlet leading out of the digestion chamber. So again, this image here on the right is of the large pit on the south side of the structure. And when we toured this site, I don't know if our guide was familiar with this research, but he was also saying that this pit is connected to a shaft that leads into the structure and into that primary chamber. So he was even aware that this pit was connected to the actual pyramid itself. And again, that theory was corroborated when they did this examination using the ground penetrating radar. And you can even see that there's shafts that lead off of this structure. So again, I do believe that all of these pyramids were interconnected, and there are shaft systems that run underneath the entire network on the east side of the Nile River that connect these pyramids. And again, they weren't just isolated structures, they were all connected, and this system operated on a very, very large scale. Again, it was a chemical manufacturing plants. So again, these diagrams don't really show those outlet shafts, but you can see, again, the collection chamber at the top of the fermentation chamber. And all you would have had is a little outlet shaft on the top here where you can collect the gas. So originally, again, this was a mastaba, or a single level platform. You see here on the left, you have your collection chamber at the top. And again, you would have just collected the gas out of the top of the structure. And again, the fact that the original inlet shaft was extended kind of refutes the fact that this was originally intended as a burial structure. That just doesn't make sense to me. Because again, you would want to seal it off as well as possible if you had intended to bury somebody in here. So again, this just shows what a mastaba would have looked like. Again, you have this rectangular shaft, or this rectangular chamber. This one doesn't even show an inlet or outlet shaft, but again, you would have had those for the creation of methane. So here are some old, yeah.
The word for bench, just to drop that in there.
What was that, Alan?
Mastaba is an Arabic word for bench. So you have those, I believe that's the right pronunciation, mastaba or mastaba. But yeah, that's just the word is an Arabic word for bench, as I understand it.
Right. And so again, during the first degree, a query is given the history of his people's his people's occupation of the Sahara and of the Nile River Delta and the evolution of the step pyramid. So again, they originally excavated this fermentation chamber from the bedrock. The mastaba was built on top of it. And as the demand for the fuel and the supply of the agricultural and raw materials increased, they also increased the scale of its production. So the structure grew, the operation in general, the scope of the work was increased, the amount of gas that they were producing was increased. And these are some just old photos that show the inside of the step pyramid during the excavation process. And again, I'm not trying to argue that these structures were not repurposed by the dynastic Egyptians. All I'm trying to say is that they were repurposed by the dynastic Egyptians. So again, you see these quote unquote galleries that are on the south side of the structure. This picture here on the left would have shown what that inlet shaft leading into the structure looks like. And this is the shaft leading down into the primary chamber. So here are some images of what they actually found in the tunnels that are adjacent to the main chamber. And you see all this pottery here. They have these rooms that are called the Funerary Apartments with this, well, it's plaster. It's plastered onto the tunnels with this blue faience tile, and I'll show some modern pictures of that as well. And again, it's very, very apparent when you look at the modern pictures that what was added by the dynastic Egyptians was not necessarily part of the original structure.
Just a point in place, well, for instance, in Karnak Temple, where you have these columns. Now, if you're familiar with Karnak Temple, you'll see that the columns, there's a certain point underneath where it's let's just say eroded away, and then above you can see some highly detailed hieroglyphs. But if you look close at those photos, you'll see that it's not actually stone that these hieroglyphs have been made into. Like, as you mentioned,
Correct.
plaster. It's lost the actual recipe of it, but it's so often people confuse stone carving in Egypt with plaster.
Right.
And they create plaster, which was, again, people think it's granite or limestone, but it was plastered on, and they didn't even necessarily carve the hieroglyphs in. They stamped them in while the plaster was wet. And right. In Pyramid of Unis and those where the pyramid texts are, again, a lot of people will often say, oh, but this was carved in stone. But no, it was actually, you can see that the plaster's falling off in some places.
Yep.
And this, the Egyptian plaster was not the plaster of Paris when most people would think of it. It's a material which, a lot like concrete, gets harder and harder over time. And just, a lot of people look and assume it's carved in stone, but a lot of these carvings in Egypt were done in plaster, and they could have been stamped on with a template rather than cut in with a tool.
Right. And you see that across the board in pretty much every structure that you go to in Egypt, where this plaster covering is overlaid on top of these megalithic stones, that again is an indication that they were just repurposed by the dynastic Egyptians, and they plastered over it. They put some of their art and hieroglyphics and pharaonic burial related stuff. But again, the older structures and the older masonry that you look at, there are no hieroglyphics. There is no artwork. Again, they had no reason for adorning these structures with these things, because again, they had a functional purpose. If you look inside any of the major pyramids, like inside the Great Pyramid or inside the Red Pyramid, there's no hieroglyphs. There's no art. Again, why would you put that stuff inside a structure that was producing chemicals? You wouldn't. But in some of these, again, small pyramids and other sites where they found these burials, again, all of this stuff is plastered onto the walls. It's not part of the original structure. It was added by the dynastic Egyptians as they repurposed these things for burial purposes. And again, I'm not trying to argue that they didn't do that. They absolutely did. Again, all I'm trying to say is these structures were here before, and they were originally intended for something different. All right, so this is a very interesting part of the presentation for me, because because there's two major ways that you can produce methane. So you can utilize the biological approach, where you have water, your agricultural material for the carbon, and the cattle manure to initiate the digestion and fermentation process, which produces methane. And you can also obtain it from geological deposits, and they call these natural gas fields today. And we drill into these natural gas fields where the methane and the natural gas is trapped within these geological deposits. And you'll see here, again, this is a modern photo from the Acida project, and they got access into this structure. Now it has been reopened to tourists, and I do intend on going in there myself. But at the time we were in Egypt, it was forbidden. How did these guys get access in here? Again, the Acida project is an amazing website, and I give them lots of credit for what they were able to get in and see, because they're amazing researchers and their documentation is pretty awesome. So again, you'll see here that the stone that composes this central chamber is black. And could the builders of this structure have excavated this chamber into an area that had existing geological deposits of methane? I think that's absolutely possible. And it certainly would have increased the overall output of methane that was being created in the structure. And I think that's one of the reasons that the tunnels that are adjacent to the main chamber were originally excavated, was again to increase the output of methane that was being produced in the structure by utilizing not only the chemistry of the fermentation process, but also the natural deposits of methane that were in these geological strata. So again, the black stone of this chamber, it's not what you typically see in Egypt, right? Everything is this yellow sandstone or limestone. So there's something very, very unique about the geology of this particular site. And again, this is just photos as you travel down into this rectangular central shaft or rectangular chamber. So the black stuff on the walls would certainly be compatible with the theory that this was used as a digestion chamber, because again, if you had fermentation going on in here, if you were using decomposed agricultural material and cattle manure, you'd expect there to be some sort of kind of staining on the walls. But I think this is actually the geology of the rock that the shaft was excavated from. Okay, so now this photo here is of that funerary apartment that I showed in those original old photos. And this is the plaster that was applied by the dynastic Egyptians. And you see this blue faience glass that was applied in here. And again, the glass making technology, again, technology, but it's really chemistry. So that is a very, very ancient science. And again, that's how you get the colors of the glass, is by using different metals in the chemical reaction process. And producing glass is absolutely chemistry. It's a different industry in and to itself. But again, it utilizes chemistry to create the final product.
I'll try to remember to put the link in. There's actually there's a great channel I love to watch called Lindy Bage, but he's in England. And so basically when the Roman Empire collapsed, the Egyptian natron from Egypt, the trade to Western Europe and to England died. And so it was basically no glass being made in England between 400 and 800 because there was no natron being imported. And so you can date the glass by the color, because I had to keep recycling the glass, and each time it would change color as well. But there's also Erica Reiner. She's really into herbs, and she references a book by the author, I can't remember, the Dictionary of Assyrian Chemistry, and some of the oldest writings from Mesopotamia includes a recipe on how to make that faience glass, but it's written in such a way that it's only if you know the language is it understandable. And then a few centuries later, somehow a king managed to convince a tradesman to teach him the secrets, and they wrote it down in plain English, let's say, and he was able to. And so, yeah, a bit like the alchemists in the European, just before the Renaissance, they would use coded language to hide their trade secrets, and that and glass making. Even the glass, Moreno glass from Venice, was highly valued for, still is now, of course, amongst antique collectors, and they knew the secrets of making the colours. So certain colours was only available for glass makers of Venice, and that was a very highly kept, tightly kept secret by by the alchemists of that time. So yeah, again, when people think alchemy, I'm sure there are a lot of aspects in regards to spirituality, religious practices, let's say, but the one thing that all alchemists share is that are all chemists.
Right.
Whether it was Boyle or even going back to Cleopatra, the alchemist, and all these others, that's the one thing I think that they all share. And there is a lot of toing and froing. And I'm not saying that these other aspects don't exist. I'm sure I know they do, because you can see them in their other writings. But throughout the centuries, alchemy as chemistry, it has been something that unites them all, despite their varying philosophical or religious or spiritual values, so to speak.
Absolutely. And again, the next couple of slides will just show this plaster material that was applied within these tunnels adjacent to the main rectangular chamber. And at the top of this picture, you can see this black rock, right? And that's where they excavated these tunnels, and this white plaster was just applied on top of it. So again, this is an indication that the tunnels were perhaps already there. Again, your original structure would have just been this mastaba platform. So again, you have your inlet shaft, your outlet shaft, and your rectangular central digestion chamber. And as the structure evolved and they improved the efficiency of production, they excavated the tunnels that were adjacent to the main chamber to again harness possibly the geological deposits of methane that were in the area to increase the overall production of the gas. And again, here, these are these funerary apartments where you could see this wall of this plaster material that was just stuck in here to again repurpose this for the burial of Djoser. And again, another point, so the rectangular, again, there's a quote unquote sarcophagus within this central chamber, which has never been opened. And again, I think there may have been some sort of remains or whatever skeletons found within these adjacent tunnels, but it was not pharaonic burial. Again, the fact that they found remains in here, I don't think that disproves what I'm saying. And again, the main point of this theory is that these things were around before. And again, I do agree that the dynastic Egyptians came in here and reused these structures. So again, to kind of recap, what we're looking at here. Yeah, go ahead.
Jump in for for instance, there's a famous, I wish I could remember her names, but there was a mastaba. It seems to have been damaged by floodwaters, and so the body was moved elsewhere. Just recently, John Romer, he's a famous Egyptologist in the Valley of the Kings. He believes he's found or close to unlocking. So essentially there was all these tombs that were then, the bodies were removed and they were placed together in a separate tomb. There's one that's already been found like that. He believes now he's very close to finding the second one. So even amongst conventional Egyptologists, a lot of bodies were moved around from one place to another during ancient times as well. So it's that just seems to be not standard practice, but it did happen very regularly where bodies were moved around, and then several, for instance, in the Valley of Kings, several tombs were emptied, and then they were placed all together into one certain vault on their own.
Right. So again, the quote unquote sarcophagus that's at the bottom of this structure, it's absolutely not a sarcophagus. And I get into much further detail as to what that component was actually used for in the second book. Yes, there is a second book coming. You and I have been through this material many, many years ago, and there was a lot of stuff that I reserved for the second book because again, I didn't want to spoil the secrets too early. There was a lot involved in these structures, and they even went through modifications and improvements during the pre-dynastic time period. Again, what we see here with this particular pyramid is that it was originally a mastaba. And as their need for the gas and the supply of the raw materials increased, the structure grew and it became more sophisticated. And we'll see those improvements also applied with the chemistry and the science and quote unquote technology that was used in the Red Pyramid. So again, the main components.
I had a flashback to Mad Max 3. And now it's been in the back of my mind. I don't know if you're familiar with the Mad Max movies, but
yeah.
Bartertown, where Tina Turner is the queen, sort of the leader there, but
yeah.
they used, the pig excrement, let's say, as the source of the methane, which gave them, lighting and heating, and sort of kept this Bartertown semi-civilized. Sorry, just a brain fart, so to say.
No, so I mean, again, this is not high tech. Again, I want to keep making that point that this is not quote unquote lost ancient high technology. This is very, very low technology. Again, to call it technology is a bit of a stretch even to me. Again, all it is application of chemistry and utilization of the raw materials that you have on hand to produce something that's going to benefit your people across the board. And again, what applications were they using it for? Pretty simple stuff. I mean, we're talking about boiling water, or rudimentary lighting, or heating your homes. Again, this is something that is utilized even today in rural areas. Again, you were presenting some evidence that the ancient Chinese were actually utilizing this quote unquote technology. And again, I don't think it's any stretch of the imagination to think that the pre-dynastic Egyptians would have also had this science and would have utilized it to their benefit. So again, this
I think it's even important I think it's even maybe an important point just to define the difference between science and technology. We now sort of think of these two as being one in the same, but science is pretty much understanding what is happening. Technology is sort of understanding what you are so to create a technology, you don't have to understand the principles behind it. You just know that it works, and you can just keep repeating it because you know it works, as where science is more about understanding why it is happening. And that's, I think, in modern times, like we now connect science and technology as inseparable, but the definition of technology, if you know something works, like a blacksmith could make, so steel is just iron with a little bit of carbon added to it. So a technologist doesn't have to understand that iron is an element. A technologist doesn't have to understand that carbon is an element. They just know that if you mix these two together, it works, and then you pass it on and so forth. But as where science is really about understanding what carbon is, what iron is, and then putting these things together. So I think it's just to separate the concept of science and technology is also an important point. Yeah, technology is about what works. You don't have to understand why it's working. You don't have to understand the principles behind it. You just know that it works. Yeah.
And I'm also not implying that, again, the pre-dynastic Egyptians had our same understanding of chemistry on a molecular level. I'm not saying that they understood how the atoms and molecules bonded and interacted together. And all they knew is that it worked and that they could utilize these products for practical applications. So again, this structure, when you look at it, it's a little bit confusing because again, it was renovated many, many times. It was renovated by the pre-dynastic Egyptians as the structure grew and the efficiency of the structure was improved. So again, it was originally the single level mastaba with an inlet shaft, the rectangular central digestion chamber, and an outlet shaft. As the structure grew, the original inlet shaft was covered by the expansion of the base, and they extended that inlet shaft so that it could still lead into the chamber. Again, if this was originally intended as a burial, you would not have rebuilt the inlet shaft, because it wouldn't be an inlet shaft. It would be a way for people to get inside your sacred burial chamber. Again, I do believe that as renovations and improvements of the structure occurred, these tunnels were excavated adjacent to the central shaft to facilitate and increase the total output of methane gas. And after this structure was out of operation, the actual dynastic Egyptians came back in here. And then again, they plastered all of this funerary related stuff into these chambers, and that's where you find this today. I do encourage everyone to go on to the Asita Project website and check out some of the pictures, because it really shows that, again, I think it's pretty clear evidence that the plaster and the stuff that was added was not a part of the original structure. And so again, just to show the folks here, this shaft leading into the top of the chamber, this is actually just a modern day entrance. This was something that was carved in the modern period as a way to get in and out of the structure. This is not part of the original structure, but this is the way you get in today.
I've actually referenced this. Look, you actually introduced me to that site several years ago, and I referenced them in a not too recent video, because they visit the Serapeum Saqqara, and they show excellent high resolution pictures of the boxes, and they took measuring devices in there to show the angles and that. I referenced them in a recent video, and so there is this argument of, you know, precision in those boxes, but I give full credit. So just to say, the Asita Project is not a mouthpiece of Zawi Hawass and the Orthodox. They actually are, let's just say, you know, open to the alternative, but they are quite, I can only give them full credit because they just take great images and they show things as they are.
Right.
And yes, I can't give them enough credit for the things that they do. And like, as you said, they got access. I think the term is backtish when it comes to Egypt, which is the dollars are great lubricants when it comes to accesses, so far as I've been led to believe. Very true.
And the Asita Project toured with the same guide that we used when we were in Egypt. And again, you know, if you talk to the right people and, you know, have enough money, you can get into pretty much anywhere. It's all about, you know, government restrictions to the access, and that can be circumvented. So another point about the Asita Project, again, it's just a great research organization, and their intention was just to thoroughly document these structures. And again, they don't make any commentary as to their personal opinion about the sites. Again, it's just very thoroughly documented. They have great high resolution photos. They're very thorough and meticulous in terms of their presentation of these things. And again, this schematic that was developed by this Latvian scientific mission, it really shows the full scope of this structure. Because again, some of those older diagrams don't depict the outlet shaft. But again, as further excavation and further study of these structures continues, we're going to start to learn more and more about these things. And again, I think if you did a ground penetrating radar scan on the entire eastern side of the Nile River, we would be absolutely shocked at what we found underneath that sand. Again, when you go to Egypt, you get the impression that what you're seeing above ground is only part of the scope of work. Again, what's underground is really the impressive thing, because again, there would have been shafts that connect these things, and there's no telling what is buried underneath the sands of the Sahara. Particularly if it is true that this civilization was, again, predating the desertification of the Sahara, as everything started to dry back out and the rain stopped. Because again, you would have had a massive civilization that existed in this entire eastern Saharan region, but all that was covered back up by the desert when that came back around.
Just to drop in there,
yeah.
Basically every cave complex in the world is made of limestone. Right. There are some exceptions here and there, But if you had, so you have the Nile next to this big expanse of limestone, it's you're going to get a cave system. So I think Carlsbad Caves, I think in America, is a famous one. We have Jenolan Caves here in Australia. And wherever you have water and limestone together, you almost invariably have large, very large underground cave systems. And I know that, like as you said, if these things were probably a little bit more explored, and as technology develops, the expanse of possibly the Nile might have disappeared in the past and was running through, just like Jenolan Caves here in Australia, where you have these underground cave systems running through the limestone. It's just whereas limestone, where you have water and limestone together, almost invariably you have a large cave system.
Right. And there's even a lot of research going on in regard to the Giza Plateau, that there was, underground springs and flowing water that ran underneath the plateau. So again, there would have been geology that facilitated these construction projects. Again, in reference to the step pyramid, they may have even harnessed the natural properties of the geology to increase the overall output of the structure that they were building. So this is a diagram that shows particularly these galleries on the western side of the structure. And I'm not going to explain what these are for. I want to, leave some material for the people that are going to read the book. But this was added during the final renovation of the structure by the pre-dynastic Egyptians. Again, as the structure evolved from the mastaba into the six-stepped pyramid, it was transformed from a very rudimentary structure into a large-scale industrial manufacturing complex. And they would have made additions to the structure that would have facilitated the production process. Again, these large galleries here on the western side, these have been excavated, and I'll show a more detailed picture of what's actually inside these things. And then you also have this complex here on the eastern side that was added when this complex that surrounds the pyramid was created. And looking here at this diagram, okay, so you have your central rectangular shaft here in the center, and we know from that Latvian scientific mission that the outlet shaft that leads out of this chamber continues to the south, and it leads directly to this pit on the south side of the complex. And that is where the decomposed, displaced material would have been collected. And then you can take that back to the farms and use that for fertilizer. And this is just kind of a detailed, blown up diagram of those galleries on the western side of the structure.
Just as a reminder, once I post this, you will be able to link that, the Latvian site, for instance. Maybe I'll pin the comment or add it to the description, just as if you could link that in there. Thank you.
Right, absolutely. And again, I'm pretty sure I got all of this information from the Asita Project website. Again, this is a great research organization, and I give them full credit for putting together these diagrams and providing the majority of the pictures for this presentation. So again, this is just a final comparison, so you can see the similarities between, again, a very rudimentary structure that is used to produce methane gas. Again, this is quote unquote modern technology that's utilized to create this gas. And then again, the ancient structure that I believe was also utilized for the same purpose. It has all of the same components. And again, so when I was working with Ed, the gentleman that has the PhD in chemical engineering, there's no reason that this theory is not possible, right? Everything about the design of these structures indicates that it absolutely could have been used for these purposes. And again, I'm not disagreeing with the fact that the dynastic Egyptians came in and reused these things. All I'm saying is they had a different original purpose, and I'm trying to reevaluate these structures from a more modern perspective, where there's so much more than just, again, pharaonic burials. Again, the form of these structures implies a function. And as we move on to the other structures, we're going to see an evolution in the complexity of the architecture and of the engineering of these pyramids. So again, when you start with the step pyramid, it's a very, very simple structure. It has one central chamber, the inlet shaft, and the outlet shaft. And then as you move into the red pyramid, into the bent pyramid, again, you can see that there's definitely a progression in the sophistication of the architecture. And I think that's an indication of the progress that was made in chemistry. Because as your knowledge and your science improves, again, the same way it does today, you build structures that can utilize what you've learned in the laboratory and apply it on a large scale. And that's exactly what this civilization was doing as their understanding of chemistry grew. And again, as their capabilities grew. Again, so the masonry and the architecture of the step pyramid, again, it's pretty primitive compared to when you get to the red pyramid and the bent pyramid. And it was a long period of time between the building of these structures. Again, I don't make any sort of proposition in terms of how long it took between one structure and the other. All I'm saying is that there was an evolution of the chemistry, and that was the reason for the construction of these new pyramids. So when I originally started, yeah.
Although I am, let's say, I follow the orthodox sort of view, the red and the bent pyramid are supposed to have been made by Snefru.
Correct.
And now the bent pyramid come first, and for a long time it's been said that there was a collapse, and that's why they changed the angle at the top. But there has been they used some laser surveying equipment, and they actually found that that explanation doesn't really work, because if it was starting to collapse, it would have been bowed outwards, but they've actually found that it's actually bowed inwards. But right. It's also important to point out that the top of the bent pyramid has exactly the same angle as what the red pyramid does. So you could just sort of shrink down the bent pyramid, you could drop it on top of the bent pyramid. And look, I don't doubt personally that you can do this with very primitive technology, but I am a little bit suspicious that it can be done in the time frames that they say, because it's you're basically laying a stone every 30 seconds.
Right.
Not impossible, but I'm a little bit dubious about the time frames sort of given in regards to their construction. Now, also the Caffrey Pyramid and the Great Pyramid, you can see, especially in the Great Pyramid, actually both of them, you can see at the corners that they've built on bedrock, that there was actually something there originally that they've added onto. Right. And no one's really sure, especially the Great Pyramid. So the bottom right-hand corner, you can see that there is still something of a, let's call it like a mound underneath there.
Right.
But no one's really quite sure how much of the Great Pyramid or Caffrey's pyramid internally is actually still a natural structure, because there's the famous grotto in the Great Pyramid, which is in the bedrock itself. Right. So again, I'm a promoter of, not a promoter, I lean towards the orthodox, but I definitely, there are many questions in regards to that. So I'm not just a mouthpiece for Zoe Hawass or Mark Lerner. So I do lean in that direction, but there are some, based on the evidence, not just on my personal opinion, there are questions in regards to whether it's the bent pyramid, the red pyramid, or the Giza pyramids, what's actually going. Because, for instance, Kent Coway's pyramid is the fourth largest structure of the Giza pyramids. That is built from bedrock. With some tight facade built around the outside. So again, as I'm saying, I am a conventionalist in a lot of senses, but I do, it is a little bit of a stretch. There is no writing really. There are some, for instance, the Mero writing. There are a few other pieces talking about that, but they're not definitive, I must say. I do lean in that direction, but there are some very interesting questions in regards to the time frame given for the construction of the Great Pyramids. And if you just do the maths, there are some, well, you know, you're really stretching, especially Sneferu, that he was able to politically create, you know, it's like, here's this huge project. Oh, I don't like this bent pyramid. I'm going to make another one. Now
Right.
it's a little bit of a, you know, it's sort of, yeah, it would be, yeah, you know, it would have been very, very powerful if he could get away. I don't know. I actually saw a Futurama episode where they went to this Egyptian type of planet, and then Bender the robot become the pharaoh.
Right.
And then he created a huge Bender statue, and he said, "Oh, I like it, but let's build a bigger one." And at that point, they wrapped him up in bandages and threw him down there, because it's sort of like, "Screw you, dude." You know what I mean?
Right.
We've done enough for you already. And so there are, like, I do lean that way, but I'm not 100% convinced on some of the timeframes of the construction, or even, yeah, there are, and there is no smoking gun yet. There is no, it is built on a lot of circumstantial evidence rather than definitive evidence in regards to that case, I must admit.
So the exact date that I use in the book is circa 7000 BC, right? So if the civilization arrived into the Eastern Saharan region around 8500 BC, they would have had 1,500 years to develop their chemistry and to improve their masonry and architecture. So again, when they arrived, you know, let's say it's 8500 BC, this mastaba was created and your little fermentation chamber was excavated from the bedrock. And that was all you had at that point. Again, it was a very primitive structure that was designed to produce methane gas. And during the hundreds of years that followed, the structure would have gradually grown, the scale of production would have increased, your total output of methane would have increased. And along down the line, somebody made a discovery that utilized the methane to transform it into another chemical. And that would have been the impetus for the design of the Red Pyramid. And even in my book, I do believe that the red and bent pyramids were most likely constructed simultaneously. And as you mentioned, the taper at the top of the bent pyramid is the exact same angle as the Red Pyramid. And I do believe that is an indication that these structures were connected. Again, everything about these pyramids is designed to be evaluated and understood, right? You can learn more about the structures by taking their measurements, by investigating the architecture and the engineering of their internal components. You can begin to understand their intention as chemical reaction facilities. So again, you can extrapolate the knowledge that was encoded in these structures by just taking time to measure them and study them and understand them. And again, I think that during the development of Egyptology, they didn't have the perspective that we have today to evaluate these structures as possible chemical manufacturing facilities. All they understood them to be was burial chambers, because again, they found the evidence that the dynastic Egyptians had left, and they took that at face value and didn't dig any deeper. All I'm trying to do is present a different alternative theory and shine light on these structures from the perspective of chemistry. And again, I remember when I was in Egypt after we went to the Red Pyramid, I pulled up, you know, just some pictures of my phone of these little lab sets. And, you know, again, what you see here on a small scale can be applied to what these structures look like on a large scale. And instead of looking at the pyramids as just these structures that contain burial chambers and shafts, if you look at these chambers as flasks, or, you know, these shafts as connecting tubes, you can really start to understand that they are connected to the science of chemistry. And imagine just putting put a pyramid around this diagram of this chemical apparatus, and you'll begin to see it's very compatible with what you see inside the pyramids. So I think it's just a different way to evaluate these structures. Again, your boiling flasks, your distillation tube, your collection flask. Again, that's exactly what you have here in these structures. And each one of the components of these pyramids is a unit of a chemical manufacturing process. Again, your chambers are your reaction flasks. Your shafts are either used to deliver chemicals or deliver the raw materials into the collection flasks. We'll get into the function of the northern shaft in the Red Pyramid, because again, it had a bit of a different purpose. Again, it was more of a mechanism of operation than a delivery tube. But that's all I had for today. Just wanted to dive a little bit. Again, I know people are eagerly anticipating a more thorough explanation of the structures and of the chemistry. And again, I just really appreciate you taking the time to do this with me this morning. And I look forward to seeing everyone's comments and feedback on this one. If you're, hopefully you guys are still on board. Again, this is the point where people are either going to love this material or they're going to hate it. And again, I'm totally okay with that. I understand that this theory is not going to be for everyone, but I do think it's pretty compelling. And I think this is a more appropriate way to reevaluate these structures. And again, just do some justice to what I think their original intention was.
While we've got that picture up, so on the Maidum Pyramid,
Yes.
the top right, that has the 7:11 proportion, which is exactly the same as the Great Pyramid, which is at the bottom right there as well.
Yes.
I've done videos on this in the past, but for the moment, let's just assume it was coincidence. But there is a certain, okay, for instance, at the Red Pyramid, they found a pyramidion, which was precisely 1 meter high, but it also has the 7:11 proportions, which means it's 3 Egyptian royal cubits wide at the base.
Right.
And this is what really got me interested in there, because I was, again, more focused in the, to say Renaissance, Roman period sort of on, Roman period through to the Renaissance. But by looking into the architecture of the past and whether it was the town plans or the temple designs, I have to say, there is a clear repetition of certain geometries which are in there. Now, that 7:11 proportion gives you half pi, which 11/7. However, if you view these things as three-dimensional, so the traditional ways to look at them, as you've shown them here, which is 2-dimensional, but these are actually 3-dimensional objects, and there are actually small deviations on each side. So if you get the best survey data, and for instance, you look at the Great Pyramid and you think of it as a 3D object rather than a 2-dimensional triangle, the very close approximation of pi and phi essentially becomes perfect if you include these slight the accidents, as they say in their construction. For instance, the Great Pyramid, the northern side is 20 centimeters shorter than the southern side,
Right.
which just happens to correspond with the shape of the Earth, because the further you get north of the equator, the circumference reduces and reduces, eventually till you get to the North Pole, and let's just call it coincidence, but there isn't. The Red and the Bent Pyramid, for instance. So the Red Pyramid, if you were to unfold that, you have a pentagon or a pentagram. The bottom half of the Bent Pyramid, if you were to unfold that, you have a hexagon. And there is just this, and it's very, I must admit, the conventional history really begins with the Greeks, and they say, look, anything but before the Greeks, they didn't understand pi, they didn't understand phi, they didn't really have any sort of sophisticated mathematics. But just by looking at the geometries of the pyramids, now the Caffrey Pyramid, which is the middle pyramid of Giza, that's 2, 3, 4, 5 triangles fused together. This pattern is repeated all across the pyramids going way down south. So it's an important question. Like as looking at the geometries of it, there is an extraordinary series. I call it the symphony of coincidence when it comes to these really important geometries, whether it's the 3, 4, 5 triangle, the golden ratio or pi, you know, at this point it becomes a matter of whether you want to believe it or not. But whether it was by accident, these series of pyramids which you were pointing have a very specific geometry to them. You know, whether it was by accident, well, then it's a symphony of coincidence.
Right.
Or possibly the fact, I don't personally believe that, because the metrology, the measurements that these pyramids have point to a very clear method in my mind, that they were actually very sophisticated in mathematics.
Right.
That doesn't require, again, lost high technology. It just requires that someone was able to do some, you know, we're not talking about really advanced geometry and mathematics in the modern sense. We're talking about some, you know, basically Fibonacci series, the observation of sunflowers, or the way that the golden angle, as they call it, the way that plants grow. That these are very natural. They're not what's the term I'm looking for? But it's basically, it's natural geometry that you would observe in nature if you're paying attention to some very basic mathematics and geometry, such as the Lucas numbers or Fibonacci numbers, which lead to the golden ratio, such as sunflowers and so forth. And that's why this idea excites me. So I want to hear more about it, but because as a good example, you know, in 1900 it was horse and cart. Now, I'll tell you, like my grandfather. One day he come home. Mum told me this story, and he went on a bender for 3 days because he was convinced he had seen a witch fly past. It actually turned out that he had seen the local priest on a bicycle, just like riding past, you know, behind the wall. But he had never experienced a bicycle before, so he didn't. You know, so to his mind, it was a witch flying past. And that there is, you know, your reality, the way that you view the world really defines the way that you view everything, whether it's in the past or in the future. And I think that's, whether it's in the past or the present, it's easy to get caught in your mentality. So I would say the same with stonemasonry, so this lost ancient high technology now. People have a viewpoint in regards to what can be done with granite. Now, because they've only seen granite worked with modern tools, they sort of live in this mindset that it can't be done with primitive techniques. But I've done plenty of videos, well, it can. You know, I used to live in that bubble. It's, how did they drill granite? All I did, then I grabbed a copper tube, I started drilling myself. Well, it can be done. And I think it's an important point, so in regards to this. So again, you're talking about relatively simple chemistry.
Yes.
And so people will tend to go, well, this is lost high technology, because of the sort of the YouTube pollution, let's call it, in regards to anything which is not of the conventional viewpoint must be there for ancient aliens type of technology. But just for those who are viewing, just again to remember, you mentioned fermentation. Now, another story, my uncle, he was not an alchemist, he was not a scientist, but he used to brew his own wine. When we went to visit him one night, we all woke up because there was an explosion. One of his, you know, his homemade wine exploded because he hadn't vented the gases properly.
Right.
So that gets the fermentation as well. So you don't need to understand the hardcore science of what's happening in fermentation to know what's happening. You just observe the results. So you're speaking about methane, and I mentioned that the ancient Chinese. You don't need to understand the chemical signature of methane to know that if you create this process and light a fire there, you know, it creates a fire. So again, the difference between science and technology. And exactly. So a lot of these things could have, you know, it could very well be that they understood the science of it, but that's really irrelevant to the point. The fact is that they understood just by brewing your beer or brewing your wine, at some point a vessel would have exploded and someone would have said, oh, look what happens, you know, and so we can repeat that, or we can take advantage of that. Maybe there was a candle next to the fermentation process and this caused an explosion, and some, you know, it just clicks in their mind, right. Oh, we could use this as a source of fuel. You don't
Right.
need to have a scientific understanding of what's happening to be able to repeat the process.
Right.
The sword makers of the Renaissance period, they didn't necessarily understand all the hardcore periodic table to understand what was happening. It was just a matter of the technology of, this works, let's repeat it. And by trial and error, you can improve the process.
Yeah.
And so just to separate the technology from the science, which is a sort of a modern connection as well. But yeah, but you don't need to understand the molecular level of why it's happening to be able to repeat it and to improve it.
Right. So knowledge of chemistry is derived from observation of the natural world. And again, if chemistry is the predominant science of your ancient civilization, you would have had people observing natural reactions and doing experimentation on using different materials to determine the result. And again, it's not a stretch of the imagination that they would have discovered fermentation and would have been experimenting with the raw materials that they had on hand. And as you mentioned, as the measurements of the exterior of these structures imply a knowledge of mathematics, the engineering on the inside of these structures implies a knowledge of chemistry. And we'll get into that in further depth in the next videos, because again, the architecture and the engineering of the Red Pyramid is significantly more advanced than what we see in the Step Pyramid. Because again, the Step Pyramid was a very simple structure that utilized very, very basic chemistry to produce something that was pretty amazing. But again, the chemical reactions in the Red Pyramid and the engineering and the mechanisms of its operation were a bit more complex. And again, all that indicates to me is a development in the understanding of chemistry. And again, I'm not making any sort of suggestions as to the time frame in which this happened, because again, it would have taken hundreds and hundreds of years for them to develop this. But again, that's why I use the time frame in the book that I do, because it provides a wider scope of time for these developments to have occurred.
Well, in our discussion last night, you sort of mentioned in regards to methane and then percolation, to, basically
Correct.
by running it through water.
Yes.
In my youth, I once saw someone engaged in percolation, which
Sure.
was using a water pipe, let's say.
Sure.
I never did this myself, let's say, okay, yeah. But for those who might have seen this, okay, but you don't need to understand the chemistry of it in a university sense to to see how this works in real life. And
Right.
And so of the basis of even our modern world and modern chemistry is this water. We don't take, whether it's just for drinking or for cleaning, but aqua vita, as they say, the water of life. And it is so important to our ancient past and to our modern past. Something I wanted to mention earlier was the use of water wheels. Now, hasn't been confirmed, but there are still some, there's a 2,000-year-old water wheel that's still in use to this moment. So especially when the flood was happening, again, it's not high technology to attach a water wheel to drive industry such as the Romans did with aqueducts, but also to lift water. Another technique is to create like a V-shaped channel, and I know they still use this in Southeast Asia, where you can lift water up to a higher level. So you have a wide opening of the channel, and you use the bend of a river, and as the water's forced into the channel, it actually lifts up, and you can elevate water even without a water wheel to
Right.
bring it to higher levels. And these are ancient technologies still in use now. I think that's one of the problems we have. For instance, lifting would be one of these issues. We're so used to being able to ring and lift and to bring a crane on site to do a heavy lift that we've forgotten how the people used to do it. The old 100 years ago, if you were on a farm, you couldn't do this. You had to use your own, not only your own muscle, but also your own noggin and knowledge. And so if you can tie a knot properly, you can actually lift massive weights on your own. This is the same principle as sailing technology.
Right.
And I think that, at least in modern times, we've become so separated from, I don't even like the term primitive technology. I don't think it's actually, I think that does not do it justice, because what we refer to as primitive is actually, if you can do something without a multi-million-dollar crane, I don't call that primitive. I call that genius. I think it's actually primitive to rely on a fancy machine that you don't understand, as opposed to being able to do something, you know, on your own merit, with your own muscle, with your own mind as well. And I think that's also, like, this term primitive is a little bit deceptive. You know, it sort of makes people think of the Flintstones, you know, rather than realize how genius. If you can do something with very little, I think it's actually, you're much cleverer than the person who relies on very advanced modern technology to do the same thing.
Right. And I think that's one of the reasons that these structures are so impressive, is because, again, they utilized very, very basic principles, but it was knowledge, and it was a thorough understanding of natural science and understanding of the natural world that allowed them to achieve these really, really miraculous feats. And like you said, with, again, the percolation, percolation is a way to remove impurities. And there are a number of different applications for that chemistry and for that science. Again, I didn't get into a detailed explanation of the components that were added as the step pyramid complex underwent its final renovation, because during that transformation into the 6-stepped pyramid, the galleries were added on the western side of the complex, and there was actually a processing and purification facility that was added on the eastern portion of the complex. But again, they would have absolutely known about, you know, bubbling gas up through water to remove impurities, or, as we'll also see in the bent pyramid, percolation was used to facilitate a chemical reaction. So again, let's go ahead and wrap it up for today, and we can jump on here in the next video. Unfortunately, doing this research and writing the book and making this videos is not my day job, and it's time for me to head on over to that part.
No problem. I know what you mean. It's a thing of love, not of
correct,
not for profit.
Yes. So anyway, Alan, thank you so much for, again, taking the time to do this with me. I love making these videos, and I really appreciate you giving me the platform to share this information. Again, I'm just trying to present a theory here, and you know, at the end of the day, my story is a fictional story, but I think it has some merit in terms of the applications of the chemistry. And again, it just paints a different picture of what this ancient civilization was actually like. And they were very, very knowledgeable, and they had an intimate understanding of the natural world, and they would have applied that knowledge to benefit their civilization. And I believe that is the true purpose of the Egyptian pyramids.
Excellent. Thank you for coming on. And I think if anyone looks at this last particular image, they might notice the angles and something that's happening on there, but we'll leave that for the future presentations as well. But there are enough Easter eggs, I think, planted in here to start to see where we will be headed in the future. So I'm a little bit impatient myself. I'd like to, you know, sort of drop it all there, but I also understand that it sort of needs to be a little bit drip fed to get there as well. So okay, I'll zip my mouth for the moment and look forward to the future. Again, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share this. Very excited about it. Again, I think it's something that could be looked at in depth for people who, you know, people who have access, possibly in the future, they'll be able to take some swabs or do some more cold-face research as well. So that's what I think it's exciting, because it doesn't rely on this question marks. You know, there is a way to test it, and that's what I think that's exciting for me. And in regards to the bureaucracy and the industrialization, which is, again, something that's overlooked in ancient history. We sort of tend to think of industrialization as something very, you know, English or French or German of the recent times, but we don't really, like we need to open our mind, I think, in regards to ancient technologies as well. I'll try to remember to put a link into Vitruvius, the 10 books of architecture, because he's got some amazing stuff in regards to what the ancients were doing in regards to chemistry, to lifting, to stone working, concrete, the Roman concrete and stuff like that as well. And there is quite a legacy of knowledge from the ancient past, but it tends to be overlooked. And there is a bit of a bias in regards to anything that come before Greek history in regards to mathematics or geometry. So anything before Pythagoras or Plato, sort of, that seems to be fringe. But yeah, anyway, so again, thank you very much for coming on. I look forward to more in the future, and apologies to the audience, but I think this does need some introduction and to move through it step by step, because if we were to drop it too quickly, it would just be a bunch of unsubstantiated claims, and I think it is important to look at it step by step. So Thank you for coming on. Yeah.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Alan. Thank you so much. And again, there's much more to come, but just one step at a time. And thank you so much, Alan. I'll talk to you soon.
Cheers, man. Have a good one. Cheers from Sydney.
Cheers.